All right, let's dive into something pretty fascinating today.
Okay.
We're going to be looking at China and the factors that have allowed it to operate at such a massive scale throughout
Hmm.
its history, both in terms of like its political systems and its economy,
Yeah,
how they've kind of grown together. And our guide for this deep dive is going to be Yasheng Huang's book, The Rise and Fall of the East.
that's right. And Huang uses this acronym EAST to represent exams, autocracy, stability, and technology.
Okay.
Really,
Hmm.
it's kind of a framework for understanding how all these different elements
Yeah.
have actually kind of intertwined to shape China's trajectory. And what's really interesting is how it challenges some of the common narratives
Right.
about China's success.
So before we get too far, let's define
Okay.
scale and scope,
Yeah.
because I have a feeling those are going to be pretty important in this whole conversation.
Absolutely. Think of it this way.
Okay.
Scale is all about expanding and applying a system over a large area or population. China's bureaucracy, stretching back centuries, is a perfect example of achieving massive scale.
Right.
Scope, on the other hand, refers to the diversity of ideas or values, or even just the ways of doing things within a society.
Got it. So a society with high scope allows for lots of different viewpoints and approaches,
Right.
while one with high scale can implement policies pretty uniformly over a vast population. What's interesting is how Huang argues that the Chinese autocracy has historically achieved scale by actually suppressing scope.
Exactly, and that's a stark contrast to how democracies tend to operate.
Mm-hmm.
Democracies preserve a lot of scope on many issues while achieving scale through consensus on certain fundamental principles like elections and the rule of law.
So China prioritizes uniformity and conformity.
Right.
While democracies are more comfortable with a greater variety of opinions and approaches,
Right.
it makes you wonder, what are the trade-offs? Does one approach ultimately lead to more success than the other?
That's concisely what Huang explores.
Right.
And a great place to start is with the first E in the East framework, exams.
Okay.
Specifically the Kiju, which was China's civil service examination system.
Oh yeah, the Keiju. I've heard about this.
Yeah.
Thousands of people crammed into these tiny cells for days on end, writing these incredibly difficult essays. It sounds like something straight out of a movie.
It was pretty intense. Imagine this system started way back in 587 AD,
Wow.
centuries before anything similar popped up in the West.
I had no idea it went back that far.
Yeah.
So how did it actually work? Was it really all about identifying the absolute smartest people in the empire?
The goal was to standardize knowledge and skills, creating a filter for specific qualities they wanted in government officials.
Okay.
In theory, it was supposed to reduce the influence of family connections and promote a meritocratic ideal. Of course, in reality, it was always that simple, as we'll see later.
Right.
But the main point is that it created a uniform standard across this vast empire, which ties directly back to that concept of scale.
That's pretty mind-blowing. But those 8-legged essays they had to write,
Yeah.
weren't those incredibly rigid?
They were.
How could that possibly be a good way to measure like true talent and potential?
Well, that rigid format wasn't accidental.
Okay.
It actually reinforced a very particular style of writing and thinking, one that valued conformity and adherence to established norms.
Okay.
And what's fascinating is that Huang sees an echo of this even in today's China, particularly with the Chinese Communist Party, and how they approach things like technology and AI development. There's a strong emphasis on control and making sure things align with the party line.
So is it possible that this emphasis on like rote learning and following the rules even way back then could have stifled creativity?
It's possible.
Could that be connected to the Needham question,
Yeah.
the one about why China didn't develop modern science, even though
Right.
they had all these technological advancements earlier on?
That's a really interesting connection you're making, and it's something we'll definitely come back to when we discuss the T in East.
Okay.
But for now, let's shift our focus to the second A in the framework.
Okay.
Autocracy. This is where we really start to see the tension between scale and scope play out in China's political system.
This idea of China suppressing scope to achieve scale
Right.
is super intriguing to me.
Yeah.
Are there any historical examples that really show how that worked in practice? Maybe comparing China to like a Western power or something?
Absolutely. Huang does this brilliant comparison between Emperor Wanli of Ming China and King Henry VIII of England.
Okay.
Both were powerful rulers in their time, but they faced very different kinds of constraints.
Okay.
Wanli, for instance, wanted to break from tradition in choosing his heir,
Uh-huh.
But he faced huge pushback from those Confucian scholar officials.
Ah, those Confucian scholars always sticking to their principles.
Right.
So even the emperor couldn't just do whatever he wanted.
Exactly. He was bound by traditions
Mhm.
and the influence of this powerful group of scholar officials.
Okay, so compare that to Henry VIII.
Right.
Obviously a powerful king, but
Powerful king. But he ran into roadblocks, too.
yeah,
Think about his desire to divorce Catherine of Aragon.
right.
That was challenged by the church, by parliament, and by societal norms.
Even a king couldn't just decree a divorce.
Exactly.
Wow.
So even with all his power, Henry still had to navigate this more complex political landscape.
Right, it wasn't just top-down rule like we see in the Wanli example.
Precisely. And this difference highlights a key contrast between the Chinese and Western systems.
Hmm.
In China, power was concentrated vertically, with fewer checks and balances compared to that more pluralistic Western model.
Interesting.
This difference in approach also played a role in the remarkable stability of Chinese dynasties
Oh, yeah.
compared to those in the West, which conveniently brings us to the S in East. Stability.
Stability. That's something China has definitely been known for throughout its history. Dynasties lasting for centuries, weathering all sorts of internal and external challenges.
Right.
How did they manage that?
Well, Huang argues that, believe it or not, the Kiju system itself actually contributed to that stability.
Really?
By cultivating loyalty to the emperor among those scholar officials, it created a more harmonious relationship between the rulers and the ruled.
Okay.
This, in turn, made things less likely to erupt into violence and instability.
So a well-educated and loyal bureaucracy helped keep the ship of state steady.
Right.
That's fascinating.
And you can actually trace this shift towards a more stable system back to the Sui dynasty,
Okay.
which ruled from 581 to 618 AD.
Okay.
Before the Sui, you often had a much more antagonistic relationship between the emperors and the officials. After the Sui, with the Kiju system firmly in place, this more harmonious, more stable system emerged.
It's amazing to think about how a single exam system had such massive consequences.
Yeah.
It wasn't just shaping the bureaucracy, it was shaping the entire political landscape.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But all this stability, while impressive, also begs an important question.
Okay.
Did it come at a cost?
Okay.
Did it maybe stifle the kind of dynamism and innovation that we see in other parts of the world?
Right.
And that leads us perfectly to the final element of the East framework. Technology.
Hold on, before we get there, if we're talking about stability potentially stifling innovation,
Yeah.
aren't we basically back at the Needham question?
We are.
The one we touched on earlier about why modern science didn't develop in China, even though they had all these technological advancements way before Europe.
You're absolutely right. That's where we're headed. And what's really fascinating is how Huang uses data to challenge some of those common assumptions
Okay.
about the answer to that very question.
Data always adds another layer, doesn't it?
It does.
So what does it tell us about how things played out in China?
Well, according to Huang, the peak of Chinese inventiveness actually occurred much earlier than most people think.
Okay.
It wasn't during the stable Ming dynasty, but during a period known as the Han Sui Interregnum, which lasted from 220 to 581 AD.
Wait a minute, that was a period of political fragmentation, right?
Right.
Lots of conflict, different ideologies battling it out.
Exactly.
Not exactly the picture of stability that usually comes to mind when you think of Chinese dynasties.
That's exactly the point Huang is making.
Okay.
That era, that lack of a single dominant power and ideology, that era of contestability may have actually fostered more innovation compared to the later, more stable dynasties,
Right.
where the Kiju system enforced so much conformity.
So maybe, just maybe, too much stability can actually be a bad thing when it comes to real groundbreaking advancement.
That's the argument Huang puts forth.
Right.
And it makes you rethink the relationship between political systems, how societies are structured, and their capacity to come up with new ideas.
It's definitely making me rethink some of my assumptions about China.
Yeah.
But let's bring this conversation forward a bit.
Yeah.
How does this East model, this interplay of exams, autocracy, stability, and technology,
Right.
how does it play out in modern China, especially during its incredible economic rise?
That's where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
The Chinese Communist Party, in a way, has taken the East model and given it a 21st century makeover.
All right, now I'm really hooked. Tell me more about how they've used this model to achieve that phenomenal growth.
Well, let's start with the reform era, which kicked off in 1978.
Okay.
The CCP did something pretty remarkable during that period.
Okay.
They actually decentralized economic power, handing it over to the regions.
Interesting.
This created competition and a dynamism that China hadn't really seen before.
Okay.
And they also started using GDP growth as the main performance metric for those regional leaders.
So they created these incentives for growth,
Right.
essentially turning economic progress into a nationwide contest.
Exactly.
Clever.
It was.
It's like they turned each province into its own little mini China.
Yeah.
With its own CEO competing for resources and recognition.
Right.
And it worked incredibly well. Provinces were empowered to attract investment, develop industries.
Mm-hmm.
They were basically free to do whatever it took to boost their economic output.
Right.
But wait a minute, wasn't the reform era also when we saw the rise of all those private companies in China?
Yes.
How did that fit into this whole model of central control and regional competition?
That's where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
Turns out the CCP's embrace of the private sector was a lot more nuanced than most people realize.
Okay.
One example Huang highlights is the rise of what were called township and village enterprises, or TVEs.
Okay.
They were often held up as these success stories of collective ownership.
Hmm.
But in reality, many of them were privately armed businesses operating under the guise of collectives.
So it was kind of a loophole.
Yeah.
Private enterprise flourishing under the radar of a system that was still officially socialist.
Exactly. And these TVEs played a massive role in that early economic boom.
Interesting.
Huang emphasizes that it was this free entry of the private sector, not just government planning, that really fueled that growth.
That's a crucial point.
It is.
It wasn't just top-down control. It was the entrepreneurial spirit of people grabbing opportunities that really made the difference.
Yeah.
But here's what I don't get. If this system was working so well, why did Xi Jinping change things up?
That's a great question.
Why the crackdown on the private sector?
Yeah.
Why the move towards even greater control?
That's a great question, and it leads us into some even more complex territory. We're about to enter the Xi Jinping era, and that's where the story takes some pretty dramatic turns.
Sounds like we're about to head into some choppy waters. I'm ready when you are.
Okay.
Okay, so we're talking about Xi Jinping and the shift toward greater control.
Right.
What happened? Was there a specific event that triggered this change?
There's one event that Huang points to as a real turning point.
Okay.
And it's one that most people know about, but maybe haven't thought about in terms of its economic impact. The Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989.
Tiananmen is usually seen through the lens of political repression.
Right.
But I hadn't really considered its economic consequences.
It's definitely a complex event
Yeah.
with ripple effects that went far beyond the immediate political fallout.
Okay.
The crackdown led to a purge of more reform-minded leaders within the CCP.
Okay.
It basically consolidated power among those who favored a more hands-on, state-driven approach to the economy.
So it's like the crackdown not only silenced dissenting voices,
Right.
but it also narrowed the scope of acceptable economic thinking within the party itself.
And this shift didn't happen overnight.
Okay.
It was a gradual process that played out over the years that followed. CCP became increasingly fixated on maintaining stability and control, even if it meant dialing back some of that economic dynamism that had characterized the reform era.
It's like they'd gotten a taste of what economic liberalization could do.
Yeah.
But they ultimately decided that maintaining that tight political control was more important.
That's a good way to put it.
Oh.
And that brings us to the rise of Xi Jinping,
Right.
who comes to power in a China that's already undergone these significant shifts.
So Xi is often portrayed as like the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong.
Right.
How did he manage to amass so much power? Was it just a matter of being in the right place at the right time?
Well, Huang argues that a big part of it was the weakening of the constraints on the leader
Okay.
that had been put in place after Mao's death.
Okay.
For example, after Tiananmen, the Central Advisory Commission, which was basically a body of retired CCP elders who still held a lot of sway, was abolished.
Okay.
This meant that there was no real institutional mechanism for those former leaders to keep Xi in check.
So Xi steps into the situation where there's basically a power vacuum
Right.
with fewer institutional checks and balances than his predecessors had faced.
Right, and he doesn't hesitate to use this power.
Okay.
He launches this massive anti-corruption campaign,
Yeah.
which, while targeting legitimate corruption, also conveniently serves to purge any potential rivals and consolidate his control over the party.
It's like a classic power play.
Yeah.
Using the guise of cleaning up corruption to eliminate any potential threats.
Exactly. And at the same time, she is very focused on pushing for ideological conformity
Oh.
within the CCP and within Chinese society as a whole.
Right.
He revives that emphasis on communist ideology and cracks down on anyone who dares to dissent or express independent views.
So it's a return to a more ideologically driven system.
Right.
But one that's operating in this modern globalized economy.
Right.
Has this shift towards greater control had a noticeable impact on China's economic performance?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's one that's still being debated.
Sure.
On the one hand, China has continued to grow under Xi,
Okay.
though at a slower pace than in those heady days of the reform era.
Right.
On the other hand, Xi's crackdown on the private sector, his emphasis on state-led development, these have definitely raised concerns about the long-term health of the Chinese economy.
It sounds like they're walking this tightrope, trying to maintain that iron grip on control while still leaving enough economic freedom to keep the growth engine running.
Yeah.
But is that even possible in the long run?
That's the gamble they're making.
Okay.
And it's not without its risks.
Yeah.
Huang points out that Xi's policies are creating a lot of uncertainty for investors.
Okay.
It's making people question whether China is still a reliable place to do business.
Can you give me some concrete examples of policies that are making investors nervous?
One of the most dramatic examples was the crackdown on Jack Ma's Ant Group.
Oh, yeah.
This company was on the verge of launching what would have been the world's biggest IPO.
Right.
And then, bam, the Chinese regulators stepped in and abruptly halted the whole thing.
Right.
It sent shockwaves through the entire tech sector.
That's a pretty clear signal that the government is willing to flex its muscles, even if it means disrupting the markets and spooking investors. What about this broader crackdown on the tech sector?
Yeah.
We keep hearing about increased scrutiny of companies like Tencent and Alibaba.
Right. And this crackdown is often framed in terms of promoting common prosperity and reducing inequality.
Right.
But there's another layer to it.
Okay.
It's also about the CCP asserting its dominance over these incredibly powerful tech companies.
Right.
They're basically trying to limit their influence on Chinese society.
So it's like they're trying to rein in the very forces that have been so instrumental in China's economic success.
Exactly.
That seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it?
And it raises another question. Can China really continue to innovate and compete on the global stage if they keep clamping down on their tech sector?
That's a big question with no easy answers.
It seems like Xi's approach is a big bet. He's doubling down on control in a world that's increasingly embracing openness and innovation.
Right.
It feels like a clash of ideologies.
It does feel that way, doesn't it?
Yes. And the outcome of this gamble has implications not just for China, but for the entire global economy.
Yeah, we're all watching to see how this plays out.
This whole deep dive into modern China has been fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see how that East model has evolved and adapted to the challenges of the 21st century.
Yeah.
But it definitely feels like there are even more layers to uncover, especially when it comes to the future of this model and the direction Xi Jinping is taking China.
There's definitely more to unpack.
Okay.
Let's continue this conversation in the next section, where we'll dig into some of the potential long-term consequences of Xi's approach and explore the big questions facing China's future.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From ancient exam systems to modern-day tech crackdowns.
Right.
But it feels like we're just getting to the really crucial part. What does all this mean for the future of China?
You're right. That's where the rubber really hits the road. And this is where Huang's analysis gets even more interesting and maybe even a little bit unsettling. He argues that this shift we're seeing under Xi Jinping, this emphasis on control over everything else, could actually end up backfiring.
So he's saying that by doubling down on control, Xi might actually be jeopardizing China's future prospects.
That's essentially what he's arguing.
That's a pretty bold statement.
It is bold, but Huang makes a strong case. He uses the example of Huawei, which was, for a time, a symbol of China's technological rise.
Right.
Remember, their success was built on being part of that global network of innovation, sourcing components and software from all over the world.
Right, and then those U.S. sanctions hit.
Right.
And their smartphone business basically got kneecapped.
Exactly.
Because they could no longer get the advanced chips and software that they needed.
Right.
It was a stark reminder of how interconnected the tech world really is.
Exactly, and that's precisely Huang's point.
Okay.
By taking this more insular, more confrontational approach, She risks cutting China off from those global networks of innovation and collaboration that were so crucial to their rise.
It's like they're turning their backs on the very system that helped them get to where they are.
That's a good way to put it.
Why is it really just about control? Or is there something else driving this shift?
Huang argues that Xi's worldview is deeply shaped by distrust of the West.
Okay.
He seems to believe that China needs to forge its own path, even if it means going it alone.
Okay.
And Huang suggests that Xi sees the collapse of the Soviet Union as a kind of cautionary tale,
Okay.
a warning against ideological compromise and letting Western influence seep in.
So it's almost like a Cold War mentality.
Right.
Seeing the world in terms of us versus them,
Yeah.
where any gain for China is automatically a loss for the West.
Right, a zero-sum game in his mind.
Okay.
And this kind of worldview has led to a much more assertive foreign policy, as well as that crackdown on dissent and independent thought that we talked about earlier.
So we're seeing that suppression of scope, not just in the economic realm,
Right.
but in the political and intellectual spheres as well. It's
it.
all connected.
It is, and this creates this climate of fear and self-censorship, which, as Huang points out, can be incredibly damaging to creativity and innovation.
Right.
It's hard to have truly groundbreaking ideas when you're constantly looking over your shoulder.
If you want people to come up with new ideas, new solutions,
Right.
wouldn't you want to encourage them to think outside the box,
They would think so.
to challenge the status quo?
Right. That's the paradox of Xi's approach.
Okay.
By trying to micromanage everything, by trying to maintain absolute control,
Yeah.
you could actually be stifling the very forces that drive progress and growth.
So what's the alternative?
That's the question.
Is there a way for China to find that balance between scale and scope?
It's a tough one.
Can they maintain stability and control while still fostering a climate of openness and innovation?
Right.
Can they have it both ways?
That's the big question. And honestly, Huang doesn't offer any easy answers.
Okay.
But he does suggest that China needs to move beyond this us versus them mentality. They need to embrace a more cooperative, more collaborative approach to engaging with the rest of the world.
That sounds like a pretty tall order,
It is.
especially in the current geopolitical climate.
Right.
But I guess the alternative, a world divided into these warring camps, isn't very appealing either.
Right. No one wins in that scenario.
Exactly.
And Huang also argues that China needs to open up more space for dissent and debate within its own society.
Okay.
He suggests that a more open, more pluralistic system would actually be more resilient and more innovative in the long run.
That makes a lot of sense.
It does.
But is there any indication that this kind of shift is actually happening, or is Xi Jinping just too entrenched in his current approach? Is there any chance he'll change course?
That's tough to say.
Yeah.
Huang, for his part, seems a bit pessimistic.
Okay.
He argues that the CCP, as it's currently structured, just isn't sustainable in the long run.
Okay.
He believes that these inherent contradictions,
Yeah.
this prioritization of scale over scope, will eventually lead to instability and decline.
That's a pretty sobering thought.
It is.
But even if he's right, these kinds of historical processes can take decades, even centuries, to fully play out. It's not like we're going to see a sudden collapse overnight.
True, and there are always unforeseen events, unexpected twists and turns in history.
Right.
Ultimately, the future of China is in the hands of the Chinese people.
Well, this deep dive into the rise and fall of the East has been truly eye-opening.
It's a fascinating book.
It's given me so much to think about, not just in terms of China, but in terms of how societies balance those competing forces of scale and scope.
Right.
It's a theme that resonates far beyond any one country or culture.
Absolutely.
I would say to our listeners, if you want to understand the forces that have shaped China and the challenges facing in the 21st century,
Yeah.
Yasheng Huang's book is a must-read.
It's a good one.
It will challenge your assumptions and leave you pondering some of the biggest questions facing our world today.
It is a fascinating and complex story.
Yeah.
And one that's still being written.
To wrap up, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the rise and fall of the East.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time, keep exploring.